As I mentioned a few moments ago, we're in Haggai, and we're going to be just doing our introductory stuff tonight. I want you to, as we transition between the different prophets, I want you to pay particular attention to the image that you see on the screen at the beginning of the message, because that image always has something to do with what the prophet was sharing with the nation of Israel or Judah. And Haggai spoke about the rebuilding of the temple after the Jews returned from Babylon. And so look for those pictures, and that will help sort of clue in as to what we'll be talking about, or what that prophet shared about. But tonight we're continuing in this series on the minor prophets by looking at the writings of Haggai. And we just finished with the book of Joel, and after we finish Haggai, we'll talk about Amos and Malachi, Nahum, and Obadiah. And so those are the other ones that we'll be talking about. But just as a reminder of who we are looking at and when and where they were prophesying, we're going to look at the map that we have for you. And so Stacy, if you'll go ahead and share that with us tonight, you'll see that computer is still acting up. There we go. You'll see that we just finished Joel, the book of Joel, and he was prophesying to Judah and talking to them about the day of the Lord. We've talked about that over the past few weeks. Well, now we're talking about Haggai, who is talking to post-exile Israel, meaning that after Israel or Judah was taken from Israel and taken to Babylon, spent 70 years there, Daniel in the lion's den, all of that going on, they come back to Israel after their 70 years in exile, and that's who Haggai and Malachi were prophesying to. So just so you sort of understand who they were and when they were speaking. But we'll still look at Nahum, who prophesies at Nineveh, sort of as a Jonah part 2. And also Amos, who was prophesying to the northern kingdom. You know, you had Israel and Judah, as you see on the map. He was prophesying to them before Israel was taken away by Assyria into exile. And then you have Obadiah, who was actually prophesying to Edom, the neighbors. That was the descendants of Esau, rather than the nation of Israel. And so that's just sort of to remind you of who we're talking about and who they were talking to, or who they were prophesying to. And so tonight we're going to just start right into talking about the author and the date of the book of Haggai. And the writings that we're looking at tonight were the writings of a prophet who started sharing with the nation of Israel shortly after their return from exile. We'll talk a little bit more about the timing of all of that and how that all worked out. But what we know is that the author is identified in Haggai chapter 1 and in verse 1. It tells us that it was the prophecy of Haggai. And other than knowing his name Haggai, there is basically nothing that we know about him as a person. We don't know anything about him other than the fact that we have his prophecies that have been written, and we know the timing of his prophecies because of the references that he makes to certain things. And so we know nearly nothing about him. But here's the interesting thing. He had such a profound ministry, such a profound prophetic ministry, that he's mentioned in the book of Ezra. In the book of Ezra, 2 different places, Haggai is mentioned. And if you read that name, that is the Haggai that they're talking about. Because no one else in the Bible has the name of Haggai other than the prophet. And so when he is mentioned in the book of Ezra, because Ezra was part of that group that came back and was rebuilding the temple and ministering after the return from Babylon, when Haggai is mentioned in the book of Ezra, he's always connected with the prophet Zechariah. And so Zechariah and Haggai were contemporaries. They were both prophesying and ministering basically at the same time to the people of Israel. And they were both trying to point the people back to God. That was their whole their whole thing that they were trying to accomplish. But there is no reference to what Haggai did as far as a job or an occupation. We know that, I believe Amos was a shepherd, or it's believed that he was a shepherd, but we're not told anything. We don't know if he was a priest. We don't know what his occupation was in Babylon or when he got back, other than that he was a prophet. But there is no other person in the Old Testament that goes by that is given this name. There is an interesting reference that we'll read about when we get to Haggai chapter 2 that gives us some indication as to the age of this prophet. And the indication is that he had witnessed Solomon's temple before it was destroyed. So if they were in Babylon for 70 years, and he saw the temple of Solomon before that 70 years, it goes to reason that he is more than 70 years old. We don't know how old he was when he was in Jerusalem originally, but there is a reference to that. So we believe that Haggai was probably, most likely, in his 80s, knowing that he's more than 70, obviously, when he comes back. Another interesting thing about the book of Haggai and the author is that this is the second shortest book in the Old Testament. The only other book writing that is any shorter than this is the book of Obadiah. And he's only quoted once in the New Testament, and it's in the book of Hebrews. And so those are some of the interesting things about the author and the writing itself. But as far as dating his prophecies and saying, okay, this is when he was writing, we can hit it right on top of the head of the nail. We know exactly when he was writing, because Haggai is basically 4 prophecies, okay? And we'll talk about the timing of it and how far it was between the different prophecies. But his 4 prophecies occurred in a 4-month span in a particular year. And we know that that is the year 520 BC, 520 years before Christ was born, because of references he makes to extra-biblical world history, meaning things that are outside of the Bible that are part of world history. He references, and so what are we able to do? We're able to say, oh, that's when he was writing. And so we know that it was 520 BC because he talks about it being the 2nd year of the Persian king Darius Hystaspes, I think is how you pronounce that. But we know that it was when the Persian king Darius was in his 2nd year, and because of world history, we know exactly when that was. And so we know that during this 4-month period, this is when this happened. But here's the catch. Haggai was maybe something of a historian of some sort, maybe. He may have had an affinity towards history because he mentions in his writings the exact day and month in the Jewish calendar when he was writing. So basically, you can look at his writings and say, oh, okay, in our Julian calendar, this is September the 19th, 520 BC. We know exactly when he was writing because of how meticulous he was in mentioning those dates. It's believed that Haggai returned to Jerusalem from Babylon with the exiled Jews that came back, and that he actually returned 18 years before that date. He had actually been in Jerusalem for 18 years before he started prophesying. And when he came back with the group that was with the Jewish governor Zerubbabel. He was the guy that was in charge. He wasn't the king, but he was the governor that was put in place by the Persian government. And so he was in charge then. And so because of all of these events and everything, we know exactly when he was writing. And so it gives us an idea of why he was writing and what was going on in the life of Israel when he was writing. But to further our understanding of the book of Haggai and what's going on here, we're going to look at the background and the setting of this writing, because what that does is that paints a broader picture for us so that we can understand exactly who he was writing to and what was going on in the nation of Israel at that time. We read in Ezra chapter 1. Now, we're not going to turn there, but we read in Ezra 1 about King Cyrus's decree that the Jews could return to Israel from Babylon. King Cyrus says, okay, you can go back and start to repopulate not only the Jews, but he released a lot of people from Babylon that had been forced into the city and into the region by people like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and others. And so what he does is when the Jews go back, he puts them under the government or the civil leadership of Zerubbabel, but he also puts them under the spiritual leadership of the high priest Joshua. Not to be confused with Joshua, the military leader that followed Moses. This was the high priest Joshua, which was in charge of the worship of the Jews then. So when this group leaves Babylon, there's like 50,000 Jews that are returning from Babylon back to Israel, and they did that in 538 BC. And what they ended up doing was 2 years later they started to rebuild the temple. The Temple of Solomon that had been there, they started to rebuild it. And this temple that Solomon had built, you read about it in the book of Kings, or in the books of Kings. And when you read it in 1 Kings, it starts talking about all the stones and all the woodwork and all the gold and all the silver that goes into this, this beautiful ornate temple that is built for God. It is just so awesome to imagine what Solomon had built. It had been completely destroyed. Razed. Completely brought down to its foundations by Nebuchadnezzar when he sacked Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. And for people like Haggai who saw it in its grandeur, to see it destroyed and then to come back 70 years later and realize that it's still in rubble like you saw a few moments ago in that picture, it had to be heart-wrenching for them to see this sort of thing. But they come back, and 2 years later they start to rebuild the temple. This is their place of worship. This is where they worship God. And so they start to rebuild the temple. But there was outside opposition from the people in Samaria. The Jews and the Samaritans, they never got along. And the Samaritans were adding pressure to the rebuilding process. And the Persian governor that was in charge of the whole region, not Zerubbabel, but another governor that was over him, was not really a big fan of the Jews. And so he was sort of holding up progress, and they weren't able to rebuild or rebuild as quickly as they wanted. And then the Jews became apathetic. They got their spiritual priorities out of whack, and they just got very apathetic about their faith. They didn't want to do like they ought to do. They just got lazy and weren't concerned with rebuilding the temple. So with the Samaritans, the governor, and the apathy, it was this perfect storm that ended up causing a problem with the work on the temple, and the work on the temple ceased for 16 years. For 16 years, the rocks, everything sat idle. They didn't work to rebuild the temple because of all of these things that had been going on. And after that time, after 16 years in Israel, God calls Haggai and Zechariah and says, go light a fire under them. Go get them back to the thing that they're supposed to be doing, which is rebuilding the temple and getting their spiritual priorities in order. And thanks to the work of these two prophets, the temple was completed in 4 years. They rebuilt the Temple of Solomon in 4 years. And so we read about that in Ezra chapter 6. It tells us about the completed temple that was rebuilt. But it's good for us to know the background and the setting and what was going on at the time of the writing, because it frames our picture of this person's writing, and we understand where they're coming from. We understand what's going on. But as much as we need to know where they're coming from, we need to know what the message they were trying to get across. And so we're going to look at the theological themes of the book of Haggai, because that's more important than anything else. Is what was the message that he was trying to get across to the Israelites? What was the message that was so important, and what did it have to do with? But the main theme of Haggai is the rebuilding of God's temple, which was destroyed 70 years before by King Nebuchadnezzar. That is the main theme of the book of Haggai, is that the Jews needed to get the temple rebuilt. Haggai gave the people messages that were encouraging the people to renew their efforts to rebuild the temple. They got discouraged. They had all this outside pressure and opposition, so they just gave up. They just quit. They evidently didn't hear this morning's message on not giving up, right? They basically gave up. They quit, and for 16 years, the temple area sat fallow. I mean, it just sat there. There was nothing going on. And so what Haggai starts to point out to them is that they had misplaced their spiritual priorities. That was the big thing for them. And what that resulted in the nation of Israel was droughts and crop failures. That God brought about these natural phenomenon, or disasters, if you want to call them that. He brought about these droughts and these crop failures because the people didn't have their spiritual priorities in order. And Haggai's saying, look, there's a cause and an effect here. The cause of the problem is your spiritual priorities are out of order, and look what the effect is. Your crops are not doing good. There's drought, and there's these problems in the nation. And so what this did was, when Haggai and Zechariah, but when Haggai talks to them and prophesies and shares with them God's message, it prompted the people to work to rebuild their spiritual lives by rebuilding the temple. And so the rebuilding of the temple really symbolized more than just a reconstruction project. That's what we have to understand, is that yes, it was important that they rebuild the temple. That was what needed to go on. But the rebuilding of the temple meant so much more than just, let's get this building built. Let's get this building put up. It was much more than that. Because in Ezekiel chapter 8, okay, when the prophet Ezekiel was writing in chapter 8 and 11 in his writing, we read about God's glory being removed or leaving and no longer dwelling in the Holy of Holies in the temple. You remember when Solomon builds the temple and they're dedicating it, and the glory of God comes and fills the Holy of Holies. And that was the presence of God in the nation of Israel, and that was where they were. That was why they had the temple. It was a home for their God, so to speak. And that was God's very presence. It was representation of God's presence with the nation of Israel. Well, in Ezekiel chapter 8, after all the things that go on with the kings and everything that goes on there, that presence of God leaves. And we read about it in Ezekiel 8 and 8 through 11. But here, God is no longer dwelling in the temple. Nebuchadnezzar comes in and completely tears the temple down. And then the rebuilding of the temple by Haggai's Jews, by the Jews at his time, is an invitation for the glory of God to come back to Israel. That's why the rebuilding of the temple was so much more than just let's build this building. It meant so much more to them because it focused them spiritually on the right things. It helped to get their spiritual priorities in order because they were focused on the right thing. And that was inviting God to come back and be a part of the nation of Israel. To bless them, to be amongst them, to work in their lives, to bless the nation, the entire nation. And so it was an invitation for God's presence to return to them. That's what Haggai is trying to get them to see. That's what Zechariah is trying to get them to understand. And so all of this is going on. And what Haggai did was he used their current situation to point them towards the events of the end times. He was trying to get them to understand that the events that they were facing and the things that they were doing to rebuild the temple was really pointing not only them but us today towards the end time during the millennial reign of Christ, when the temple will be rebuilt during the tribulation. And so what he's saying is the events that Haggai experienced in 520 BC, that time frame, was a foreshadowing to the end times that we haven't even reached yet. And that's what this is what is going on. See, through his writings, Haggai was sharing that God had promised in the end times, during the millennial reign of Christ, during all of that time, that there would be a glorious temple. We read about that in the book of Revelation. But he was also pointing to the fact that there would be greater peace, greater prosperity, divine rulership, meaning God would be, or Christ would be the ruler, and a national blessing for the people of Israel. And so Haggai is trying to get them to see that, yes, in our current situation, this is what's going on. We need to rebuild the temple. We need to get our spiritual priorities in order. But guess what? God is not only telling us this for now, but he's also telling us for more than 2,500 years from now what will happen when the Messiah returns to earth. And so he's trying to share with them all of this in the present, but also pointing towards the future, just like we saw with the book of Joel. You know, Joel was talking about their current situation with the locusts, the coming Assyrian army, and then the day of the Lord, the judgment at the end times. Well, Haggai's saying, look, here's our current situation. Here's what's going on. We need to get our spiritual priorities in order. We need to rebuild the temple. But guess what? There's going to be people 2,500 plus years from now who need to get their spiritual priorities in order, who need to rebuild the temple, so to speak. And so all of this was pointing towards the future. Like we did with the book of Joel, we'll always end each of our messages with a way for us to relate the writing of the prophecy to today. And so we're going to look at how Haggai impacts us today. But as we do start to look at Haggai and what he tried to accomplish for God in the nation of Israel, we have to ask ourselves the same question that he was asking of the people in Israel. And that is, we have to ask ourselves if our spiritual priorities are out of line. That was the problem with the Jews in that day, was their spiritual priorities were way out off kilter. They were way out of line. And that's the thing that we have to ask, not just us here in the church, but when we look at our nation in general. You know, Haggai's preaching to a nation saying, look, you've got your spiritual priorities out of order. Is that not any Bible teaching preacher today? Saying, look, we live in a nation that has their spiritual priorities out of line. When we are more concerned, when people in our country are more concerned about the life of an animal than the life of an unborn child, we have our spiritual priorities out of order. Don't hear me saying that we should abuse animals or that we shouldn't be concerned about them. I'm not saying that in the least. I mean, I have animals. We should take care of those and be responsible owners of those animals. But what I'm saying is when when people are more concerned about them than an unborn child, we have issues. We've got a mixed up, backwards view of what God's view of life is. All life is precious to God, whether it's an unborn child, whether it's an adult, or whether it's an animal that he has created. We are to be good stewards of that. We are to take care of those things. That's just one way of looking at our world and our society today and seeing that there are so many people in our country that have their spiritual priorities way out of line. And part of the problem is they never had them to begin with because they weren't raised in church. They may have been disenfranchised with church and just sort of fell away from it, or whatever the case may be. But there are so many people in our country today, and I know I'm preaching at the choir when I'm saying this about our country, because if you're here on Super Bowl Sunday to hear the message, then and I'm not knocking those that aren't here. I'm just saying we live in a world where people's spiritual priorities are just out of line. It's just they're so far off base, and that's what we need. Why we need to hear the message of Haggai as much today as we do any other time. We have to understand that we must do the same thing that Haggai encouraged Israel to do. What we have to do is we must rebuild our spiritual temple and set right our spiritual priorities. That was the whole message that he told them, was rebuild the temple and rebuild your spiritual priorities in the right place. And that's the same thing that's the same message that we need to have for those that are more concerned about the animals than the unborn child, and vice versa. You know, all the issues that we see in our world today is we need to get them to understand there's a need for that relationship with Christ so that their spiritual temple can be built. And then once it is, make sure that they have the right spiritual priorities. And maybe there's those that have had their spiritual temple built. They have a relationship with God, but their spiritual priorities are out of line. They need to get them back in line. And so that's really the way that we can see going forward in this study through the book of Haggai. We'll see that's really what he's trying to preach to the nation of Israel. And so that's the end of our introduction to the book of Haggai.